Hello, Brubs. We're back with Alraune by Heinz Ewers, a 1929 translation of the book by S. Guy Endore, illustrated by Malon Blaine. We are now on Chapter 9. Let's get to it. Chapter 9. There it is, the skull of doom, with all the peoples in its clutches. Chapter 9, wherein is told who were the lovers of Alraune and what happened to them. These are the 5 men who loved Alraune ten Brinken: Karl Monen, Hans Geroldingen, Wulf Gontram, Jacob ten Brinken, and Rasp, the chauffeur. The Privy Councillor's brown leather-bound volume deals with all 5 of them, and this story of Alraune must therefore tell about them likewise. Rasp, Matthew Maria Rasp, came along with the opal car, which the Duchess Wolkonski gave Alraune on her 17th birthday. He had served with the Hussars, and now he had not only to drive the car, but also to help the old coachman with the horses. He was married and had 2 children. His wife, Lisbeth, took charge of the laundry on the ten Brinken estate. They lived in the little house next to the library, right beside the iron gate that gave entrance to the court. Matthew was blond and big and strong. He understood his job mentally as well as physically. Horse and machine obeyed his muscles. Early in the morning, he saddled his mistress's Irish mare and stood in the court and waited. Slowly, Miss ten Brinken descended the stone steps before the master's house. She was dressed like a boy in yellow leather gaiters, a gray riding suit, and a tiny peaked cap over her short curls. She made no use of the stirrups, but had Rasp hold out his hand. She stepped in it and stood there a second before she swung herself astride the saddle. Then she gave her horse a sharp blow with her whip, so that it reared and thundered out through the opened gate. Matthew Maria had the devil's own time mounting his heavy chestnut and catching up with her on his slow-footed gelding. His brown-eyed Lisbeth closed the gate behind them. She compressed her lips and looked out in the direction where they had disappeared. He, her husband, whom she loved, and she, Miss ten Brinken, whom she hated. We are reading Alraune by Heinz Ewers. Somewhere out in the fields, Miss ten Brinken stopped, turned around, and waited for him to join her. "Well, Matthew Maria," she asked, "where shall we ride today?" And he answered, "Wherever Miss commands." Then she tore her mare around and galloped on. "Hop, Nellie," she cried. Rasp hated these morning rides no less than his wife. He felt as though to Miss ten Brinken he was no more than a bit of landscape, indeed, as though he did not exist at all. But then, when his mistress did take notice of him for a second, he felt more annoyed than ever, for she never paid any attention to him unless it was to propose something unusual. She stopped at the banks of the Rhine and waited calmly until he reached her side. He did not hurry particularly, for he knew that she had some caprice up her sleeve, and he was hoping that for once she would forget it. But she never forgot a whim. "Matthew Maria," she said, "shall we swim across?" He argued against the notion, but he knew immediately that all his objections would not dissuade her. "The banks are too steep over there," he hazarded. "They would be impossible to climb, and particularly at this point the current was unusually rapid, and—" He grew angry. Whatever his mistress did was always totally purposeless. What was the idea of swimming across the Rhine? They would get wet and cold and might congratulate themselves if they escaped with nothing worse than a cold. And for all this, amounting to less than nothing, they took a chance on drowning. He determined he determined to remain behind. Let her commit as many stupidities as she wants to, but by herself. What business was it of his? He had a wife and children. He got that far in his reflections, and then he rode down into the Rhine. His heavy Mecklenburg horse was carried downstream with the current. He had all he could do to reach a safe landing place between the cliffs on the other side. He cursed and shook off the water and trotted his horse at a fast clip upstream towards his mistress. She scarcely looked at him. Did you get wet, Matthew Maria? She said with just a single ironic glance. He said nothing. He was too angry and too deeply insulted. What right had she to call him by his first name and address him so familiarly? He was Rasp, the chauffeur, and not the stable boy. His brain concocted a dozen telling replies, but his lips did not open. On other occasions, they rode over to the sand flats, where the hussars exercised. That was even more obnoxious to him, for a number of the officers and the non-coms there had known him when he served in the regiment. And the bristly mustached sergeant major of the 2nd Squadron taunted him. Well, Rasp, come back for another little ride with us. The devil take that crazy female, he growled, but he executed the maneuvers, galloping behind his mistress as she rode to attack along with the regiment. Then Count Geroldingen, how the hell would you say that? Geroldingen, captain of horse, came over on his English piebald and chatted with Alraune. Rasp remained in the distance, but she spoke intentionally loud so that he had to hear her. Well, Count, how do you like my esquire? The captain laughed. Excellent. Would just suit our young prince. Rasp would have liked to box his ears, and the missus' ears, too, and the sergeant major, and the whole damn squadron that was grinning at him. He was ashamed of himself, and he blushed like a schoolboy. But it was worse than that in the afternoon when he had to ride out with her in the car. He would sit at the wheel and watch the door out of the corner of his eye and sigh with relief when she appeared accompanied, or else suppress a curse if she came alone. Often he would get his wife to ferret out information whether she intended to drive by herself. In that case, he would frequently take a couple of parts out of the motor and lie down beneath it and monkey around as though he were repairing something. We can't drive today, miss, he would say, and then when she had left the garage he would smile with satisfaction. But this trick didn't always succeed. Often she would stand by calmly and wait. She would say nothing, but he could feel that she understood. Then, very slowly, he would set his motor in order. Through, she would ask, and he would nod. Well, you see, Matthew Maria, she would say, it's always succeeds better when I'm around. When he returned from these rides and had put the Opel into the garage and had sat down to the meal his wife had set before him, then he was sometimes seized with a trembling. He went pale and his eyes stared stonily. Lisbeth did not plague him with questions. She knew where the trouble lay. The damned bitch, he muttered. She went and fetched his 2 blond and blue-eyed boys, clad in their fresh white nightgowns, and put one on each of his knees. Then he grew gay and light-hearted again, and joined in with the laughter of his children. And when his boys were in bed, and he sat outside on the stone bench and smoked his cigar, or else when he strolled through the village, or perhaps through the old garden of the 10 Brinkens, then he would talk the matter over with his wife. No good can come of it, he said. She's getting dizzier every day. Speed, speed, and more speed. Nothing will satisfy her. 14 summonses in 3 weeks. You don't have to pay them, his wife Lisbeth said. True enough, he replied, but I'm getting a bad reputation. Just as soon as the cops see our white car, they take out their notebooks and write down IZ 937. He laughed. Well, at any rate, they can't make any mistake in our case. We always deserve our summons. He took a small wrench from his pocket and fiddled with it. His wife put her arm under his, took off his cap, and stroked his tangled hair. "What do you suppose she really wants?" she asked, and tried to make her voice sound innocent and unconcerned. Rasp shook his head. "Couldn't tell you, Elizabeth. She's crazy, that's all. And she's got a way about her that makes you do just what she wants you to, no matter how hard you want to refuse her. No matter how much you realize that it's wrong. Today, what did she do today?" Frau Lisbeth asked. And he said, "Oh, no more than usual. She simply can't bear to see a car in front of her. She must get ahead, even though it be a machine with 30 horsepower more than ours. Catch it," she says. And if I hesitate, why, she just puts her hand lightly on my arm. Then I let loose as though the devil himself was in back of me. He sighed and beat the cigar ashes from his trousers. "She always sits by my side," he continued, "and that by itself is enough to upset me and make me nervous. What new bit of nonsense will she have me do, is all I can think of. She loves to take obstacles, ride over planks and sand heaps, and so forth. A regular steeplechase. Hell, I'm not a coward, but I want a good reason for risking my skin every day. Just go right ahead," she said to me lately. "Nothing will happen to me. She's calm as a cucumber, even if we go off the road and jump a ditch at a 60-mile clip. Possibly nothing can happen to her, but I'm sure to break a rib or two sooner or later." Frau Lisbeth gripped his hand. "You must try not to obey her. When she wants you to do anything foolish, simple, say, 'No, you must not risk your life that way. You owe something to your wife and children.'" He looked at her quietly. "Yes, my wife, I know that. To you, and to myself no less. But that's the point. I simply can't say no. Nobody can say no to her. Look at the way young Mr. Gontram runs after her like a puppy dog. Look at the way everybody seems just too happy to be able to obey her insane whims. And there's not one of us employees who can even stand her, and yet we all do just as she says, no matter how silly or insipid." "That's not true," Frau Lisbeth declared. "Freudsheim, the coachman, never obeys her." He whistled. "Freudsheim! There you're right. He turns his back on her every time he sees her, but he is near 90 and has scarcely any blood left." She looked at him with surprise. "Then it does come from her. Then it does come from the blood, Matthew. And is that why you have to obey her?" He parried her glance, stared down at the ground. Then he took her hand and looked at her squarely and openly. "I want to be frank with you, Lisbeth, but I really don't know myself. I've often puzzled over it, but I can't get it clear. When she's around, I get so mad I could choke her, and when she's not here, I can't work. I'm so afraid she might call for me." He spat. "Damn her soul," he cried out. "I wish I were rid of this job. I wish I had never accepted it." They discussed it from every angle, considered every argument, pro and con, and finally they decided that he should give notice. But before that, he was to look around and see if he could not find another place. He decided to go to the city the very next day. That night, Frau Lisbeth slept peacefully for the first time in many months, but Matthew Maria couldn't close his eyes. When morning came, he asked for permission to go to town, and he went at once to an agency where, as luck would have it, he was at once sent to the commercial counselor Sonikin, who was looking for a chauffeur. Rasp was hired at a larger salary than he had received hitherto. The work would moreover be easier, for he had not to bother with any horses. The agent who had accompanied him to Sonikin congratulated him as they left the house. Rasp said thank you, but he had a feeling that there was nothing to be thankful for. He could not picture himself in his new situation. Nevertheless, he rejoiced when he saw his wife's eyes light up as he told her of his good fortune. "In 14 days, then, we'll be gone," she said. "God, I wish we didn't have to wait that long." She shook her head. "No," she declared, "not in 14 days, but early tomorrow morning they'll have to let you go. You go speak to the privy councillor right now." "That won't do any good," he replied. "He'll only refer me to Miss Ten Brinken and—" Frau Lisbeth took his hand. You leave it to me, she concluded. I myself will talk to her. She left him standing, marched across the court, and announced herself. And while waiting, she carefully gathered the arguments intended to secure permission to leave in the morning. But she had no need for any arguments. Miss Ten Brinken had no sooner heard that they wished to go without giving notice than she nodded curtly and declared that it was perfectly all right. Frau Lisbeth flew back to her husband, embraced him, kissed him madly. Only one night more, and then the bad dream would be over. They must pack at once, and he must go telephone the lawyer that he was prepared to assume his new duties the very next morning. She drew the old trunk out from beneath the bed. Her cheerful zeal was contagious. He dragged forth his old iron-bound boxes, dusted them off, and helped her pack. He handed her the various articles, and in a moment of freedom ran down to the village to see about a cart for the removal. He laughed and was content for the first time since he had come to the house of the Ten Brinkens. Then, while he was wrapping up the cooking pots in old newspapers, Aloysius, the butler, entered and announced, "Miss wishes to drive to the village." Rasp stared at him without a word. "Don't go," his wife called, and he said, "Report to Miss Ten Brinken that I can't go." He did not finish. Alraune Ten Brinken stood at the door. She spoke. "Matthew Maria, I have given you permission to leave tomorrow. I want to drive out today." Then she turned and left, and Rasp followed her. Don't go, Frau Lisbeth screamed. He heard it, but he did not know whence came the voice, nor who spoke thus to him. Frau Lisbeth fell heavily down on the bench. She heard their footsteps crossing the court to the garage. I almost said garage. She heard the iron gate creak softly as it turned in its hinges. She heard the auto move out onto the village street. And she heard, too, a single blow from the horn. That was the farewell greeting to her, which he delivered every time he rode out through the village. She sat there with her hands in her lap and waited until they brought him back to her. 4 farmers carried him in on a mattress. They laid him down in the middle of the room among the trunks and boxes, and they undressed him and helped the doctor wash him, a long white body full of blood and dust and dirt. Frau Lisbeth knelt by his side, dry-eyed and silent. The old coachman came and took away the crying boys. Then the farmers left, and finally the doctor, too. She had not questioned him either by word of mouth or by a single look. She knew the answer that he would give. In the middle of the night, Rasp awoke and opened his eyes. He recognized her and begged for some water. She gave him a drink. "It's all over," he said in a low voice. She asked, "How did it happen?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Miss said, 'Step on it, Matthew Maria.' I didn't want to. Then she put her hand on mine, and I could feel her through the glove, and I did step on it. That's all I know." His voice was so low that she had to put her ear to his mouth to hear. When he ceased, she whispered, "Why did you do it?" His lips moved. "Forgive me, Lisbeth. I had to do it, miss." She looked and started at the expression in his eyes, and she cried out so suddenly that her tongue spoke before her mind had thought. You love her?" He lifted his head, the thickness of a thumb, and murmured, his eyes closed, "Yes, yes, I rode with her." Those were his last words. He sank into a deep faint and lay thus until the morning, when he passed out quietly. Frau Lisbeth arose. She ran to the door and stumbled into the arms of old Freudsheim. "My man is dead," she said. The coachman made the sign of the cross and wished to enter into the room, but she held him back. "Where is Miss Ten Brinken?" she asked breathlessly. "Is she alive? Was she hurt?" The old coachman's deeply wrinkled brow gathered into mightier furrows. "Is she alive? Is she alive? There she is. Hurt? Not a scratch, just a little dust." And his trembling, rheumatic fingers pointed across the court. There she stood, slender and dainty, dressed for a ride in her pretty boy's costume. She lifted one foot and placed it in the hand of a hussar. Then she swung herself into her saddle. She telephoned the captain of horse, said the coachman, and told him that she had no groom for this morning, whereupon the count sent over his own boy. Frau Lisbeth ran across the court. "He is dead," she shouted. "My husband is dead." Alraune ten Brinken turned in her saddle and toyed with her whip. "Dead," she repeated slowly. "Dead. Isn't that too bad?" She brought her whip down lightly on her horse's flank and walked it down to the gate. "Miss!" Frau Lisbeth cried. "Miss! Miss!" But the hoofs struck the old cobblestones and sparks flew into the air, and she saw Miss Ten Brinken riding out even as she had ridden so many times before, trotting down the village street, a curly-headed lad as pert and saucy as any noble-born prince. But now a blue hussar from the king's troop followed her, and not her husband, Matthew Maria Ross. "Miss!" she cried in wild fear. "Miss! Miss!" Frau Lisbeth ran to the privy councillor, overflowing with hate and despair. The professor permitted her to talk herself out, and then told her that he could well understand her grief and would not hold her conduct against her. And despite the fact that they had given notice, he was nevertheless prepared to pay her husband's next 3 months' salary. But she must be reasonable. She must realize that it was all his fault, that he alone was responsible for the terrible accident. She ran to the police. They were not even polite. They had all seen it coming. Everyone knew that Rasp was the wildest driver along the whole Rhine. Truly it was just a punishment. Truly it was a just punishment, and it was her duty to have warned him in time. It was all her husband's fault, they said, and she ought to be ashamed of herself trying to put the blame on the young miss. Perhaps she thought that Miss Ten Brinken was sitting at the wheel? Did Miss Ten Brinken ever sit at the wheel? Yesterday, or indeed any day? She ran to the city to a lawyer, and then to another lawyer, and still another one. But they were all honest people and told her frankly that they could not possibly accept such a case, no matter how big a retainer fee she gave them. Yes, of course, it was quite possible, and on the face of it, convincing enough. But what proof did she have? None at all. Well, you see, why, it would be thrown out of court. The best thing she could do was to go home quietly and let the matter drop. Yes, that was all she could do. For look, even if she did have proofs, even so her husband would still bear the major blame, for he was a man and a capable and experienced chauffeur, while Miss Ten Brinken was an inexperienced young girl, still underage. She went home. She buried her husband in the little cemetery back of the church. She finished her intercepted packing and herself loaded the goods on the cart. She accepted the money proffered by the counselor, took her 2 children, and rode away. A few days later, a new chauffeur moved into her dwelling. He was fat and short, and worse still, he drank. Fraulein Ten Brinken did not relish him and rarely went driving with him alone. He was never given a summons, and the people said that he was a careful and capable fellow, and much better than that wild Rasp. Little Moth Alraune Ten Brinken greeted Wulf Gontram when he entered the room in the evening. Then the young man's beautiful eyes glowed with pleasure. "You are my flame," he said. And she said, "You will burn your pretty little wings. Then you will lie on the ground and be nothing but an ugly worm. Beware, Wulf Gontram." He looked at her and shook his head. "Oh, no," he said, "I like it." And all through the long evenings he circled about the flame. Still 2 others flew around the light and singed their wings. Karl Monen was one of them, and the other was Hans Geraldingen. Still don't know. Geraldingen. It was a matter of honor to Dr. Monen. He had to court her. "She's the best match I could possibly make," he thought. "With all her wealth, she's the very thing I've been looking for." And he could almost see his ship sailing in with every inch of canvas speed. He was a bit in love with every woman, but now his little brain beneath his hairless skull was inflamed, and he felt at one, and the same time the sum of all the emotions which he had had toward many dozens of women during many years, and even as he had always done before, that is, attributed to the girl he courted all that only he himself felt, so now too it seemed to him that Alraune ten Brinken craved him madly with an unlimited, unbounded, breathless passion. During the day he would talk to Wolf Gontram of his new and gorgeous conquest. He was pleased to think of Wolf as a kind of messenger who daily rode out to Lendennick bearing his love, and so he would send the lad off with many greetings and kisses and small presents. Not just a single rose, that was a cavalier's token. He was lover and beloved, and so felt bound to send more. As for instance, flowers and chocolates, pastry and pralines, fans, and 100 other pretty trifles and knickknacks, the little taste that he did have, and which he was well able to pass on to his pupil, melted and disappeared in the hot fire of his love. Often he and the captain of horse would ride out together. They were old friends. Formerly it was the captain who would draw nourishment from the bountiful encyclopedic treasures with which Dr. Monen's mind was stored, just as at present the recipient of this mass of learning was Wulf Gontram. As for the doctor, he was only too glad to find some use for all the accumulated lumber in his brain, and gave it away by the handful. The captain and he had often gone out together for a little adventure. It was always the doctor who had picked up the girl, and who presented with great pride Count Geraldingen to his newly acquired acquaintance. And so it frequently happened that the ripe cherries which Karl Monen had discovered were devoured by the officer of the hussars. The first time this happened, Goldingen's conscience troubled him. He felt very cheap indeed, and after a few days of self-reproach he could stand it no longer and spoke up frankly. He excused himself gravely, averring that the girl had made such eyes at him that he had not been able to resist, and he added that in the end it was better so, for he didn't believe that the girl was worthy of his friend's love. Dr. Monen took it very calmly and said that the matter was totally indifferent to him, and that it was, moreover, quite in order. For example, in Yucatan, among the Maya Indians, it is customary for a man to offer his woman to his friend. But beneath the veneer of anthropology, Geraldine saw that Dr. Monen was deeply grieved. So on the next occasion, when another acquaintance of Karl's preferred him again, he kept silent. Thus, with the passing of years, quite a number of Dr. Monen's women became those of the handsome captain, just as in Yucatan, only that in this case most of these women had never really belonged to Dr. Monen. The latter was simply the shikari, the beater, who discovered the game and drove it to within the range of the hunter, who was Hans Geroldingen. I just don't understand that name. But Hans had a good heart and never said a word about it, for he did not wish to wound his friend's feelings. And so the driver did not notice when the hunter's gun went off, and continued to think of himself as the mightiest Nimrod of the Rhine region. This is not the devil and the Jew. At least I don't think it is. Frequently, Dr. Monen would rush up to Geroldingen and cry something of this sort: "Come, Count, I have made a new conquest, a marvelously beautiful English girl. I picked her up yesterday at the open-air concert. I'm to meet her along the Rhine tonight." "But how about Ellie?" the captain asked. "Ditched," Karl Monen declared loftily. It was positively magical, the ease with which he abandoned his loves. Just as soon as he had found a new girl, he closed his account with the old one by the simple process of no longer bothering himself about her. and the girls themselves never made any fuss about it. In that respect, he was certainly far superior to the hussar who could never manage to tear himself away from a woman without difficulties of all kinds, and the women had an even harder time tearing themselves away from him. It required all the energy and all the art of persuasion that the doctor could summon to prevail upon the captain to be dragged along to a new beauty. Now the doctor was volubly insistent. You've got to see her, Captain. God, but I'm happy to have come out safe and sound through all my affairs. I'm certainly lucky not to have been hooked yet, for now I've found the real thing at last. Enormously rich, I say enormously, for his old excellency has more than 30 million, perhaps 40. Well, what do you say, Count? And his daughter is pretty as a picture, fresh as an apple blossom. Besides, and this is private, the little bird has already become entangled in my net. I've never been so sure of anything. Yes, but how about Fraulein Clara? The captain objected. Dismissed, the doctor exclaimed. I've just finished a letter in which I make it clear to her that my business expansion will hereafter take up so much of my time that I shan't have any left for her. Geraldingen sighed. Fraulein Clara was a teacher in an English finishing school in town, and Dr. Monin had met her at the municipal dance, and later he had introduced her to his friend. Clara loved the captain, and he, for his part, lived in the hope that Dr. Monin would take her off his hands when he himself married, for that would have to be sooner or later. Every now Every day now his debts were dragging him down further, and he must finally make up his mind to square himself by an advantageous marriage. Why, you can write the same thing I did, Carl Monin cried. My God, if I can do it, why, you who were a mere friend can certainly do the same. Man, oh man, the trouble with you is too much conscience. He absolutely insisted upon the Count accompanying him to Lendennick. He would furnish the necessary background for this visit to Miss Ten Brinken. Karl clapped Hans slightly on the shoulder. You're as sentimental as a freshman. I'm jilting Clara, and you reproach yourself. Always the same old tune. But look here, this is big game. She's the most charming heiress on the Rhine. Do you think this is a time for hesitation? So the captain rode out with his friend, and like the latter, he fell no less in love with this young creature, who was so unlike all the many others that had offered him their red lips to kiss. When he came home that night, he had a feeling that reminded him of his emotion that time, 20 years ago, when he had usurped his friend's sweetheart for the first time. He thought that by this time he ought to be sufficiently hardened to the sport after having cheated the good doctor so many times and always so successfully, and yet he was ashamed. For this girl, there was something entirely different. That was some way. For this girl, that was something entirely different. And his emotion toward the scarcely half-grown girl was likewise very different from his usual flirtation, and different too, as he had noted readily, were the emotions of his friend. One thing was certain, he didn't have to fear any success on the part of Dr. Monin. Miss Ten Brinken was much less likely to have him than even the other women were, but this time he couldn't be so sure that she would have him instead. The little doll-like girl had robbed him of his usual virile self-assurance. As far as that lad Gontram was concerned, it was evident that Miss Ten Brinken liked to have the handsome page, as she called him, about her, but it was equally evident that he meant no more to her than a toy with which she could do as she pleased. No, neither the glib doctor nor the handsome lad was likely to be his rival. For the first time in his life, the captain of horse weighed his chances. He was of the best ancient nobility, and the king's hussars, I'm going to say hussars, were rated the best regiment of the West. He was slender and well built, and still looked rather young, although he was already expecting to be promoted to the rank of major. He was a dilettante, and not a bad one. in all the arts. Yes, to be honest with himself, it would be pretty hard to find a Prussian captain in the cavalry who had more interest and more culture than he. Really, it was scarcely strange that women and girls simply threw themselves at him. And why shouldn't Alraune do the same? She would have a long and hard search before she found anything better, more particularly since the only thing he couldn't offer her, namely money, she, as his Excellency's adopted daughter, had more than enough of, and he could not help thinking that the two of them would make quite a pair. Wolf Gontram came to the house of the saintly Nepomuk every evening, but at least 3 times a week he brought the captain and the doctor along. The privy councillor withdrew after the meal and came in only now and then for a half hour, listened and observed, and withdrew again. He called it making a chance essay. He called it making a chance essay, and the three lovers sat around the young miss and looked at her and made love, each in his own way. For a time the young girl was amused, then it began to bore her. It seemed to her that the whole business was a bit monotonous. The family scene needed a dash of color, of life. They ought to start something, she complained to Wolf Gontram. The young man asked, who ought to start something? She looked at him. Who? Why, who else but those two, Dr. Monin and the Count? Tell them what they ought to start, he replied. They'll surely do it. Alraune stared at him. How do I know what they ought to start? She said slowly. They ought to know it themselves. She leaned her head in her two hands and looked dully across the room. After a while she spoke. Don't you think it would be great, Wolfchen, if those two had a duel and shot each other dead? Wolf Gontram couldn't see the advantage of this. Why should they shoot each other? They are excellent friends. You're just a stupid boy, Wolfchen, said Alraune. What has their being friends got to do with it? We'll just have to see how to make them enemies. Yes, but why? He asked. What good would it do? I can't see any reason. She laughed, took his curly head in her hands, and kissed him right on the nose. No, Wolfchen, of course there's no sense to it, but why should there be? It would simply be a change. Will you help me? He did not answer. Then she asked him once again, Will you help me, Wolfchen? And he nodded. That evening, Alraune and young Gontram considered how they would go about goading the two friends into a quarrel with each other, sufficiently so that one of them would challenge the other to a duel. Alraune reflected, suggested one plan, then another. Wolfchen nodded. He was still a little doubtful. Alraune calmed him. They really don't have to hurt each other. Nowadays, very little bloodshed ever occurs at duels, and afterward they will be reconciled and be faster friends than ever. That convinced him. Now he put his mind to work too. He told her about their little weaknesses, told her wherein the one was touchy, wherein the other, and so her plan grew. There was really nothing very subtle about her intrigue. It was indeed a rather childish and naive scheme. Only two people, madly in love, could possibly stumble over such a big stone. His Excellency Ten Brinken noticed that something was afoot. He questioned Alraune, and when she wouldn't answer, he went after Gontram. The latter gave him all the information he wanted. He laughed and gave the boy some good pointers for the execution of the plan. But the friendship between those two was more secure than Alraune had thought. It took her 4 weeks to convince Dr. Monin that this time his invincible attraction had failed him and he must give way to the captain, and at the same time, conversely, make the other gradually come to the realization that for once at least the impossible might happen, and Dr. Monin might triumph over him. Both of them independently reached the conclusion that it was time to spring the question, but Miss Ten Brinken understood how to prevent either of them from reaching that point. One day she would invite the doctor and not the captain. The next day she went out riding with the captain while she left the doctor waiting for her in some open-air garden concert. Each of them considered himself the preferred, but had to admit that her actions toward the other were not totally indifferent. It was the old Privy Councillor himself who acted as the bellows to blow these glowing sparks into consuming flames. One day he took Karl Monin aside and talked to him at length. He said that he was entirely satisfied with his work and that he would be far from displeased to see someone who was so thoroughly at home in every kind of business become his successor. Of course, he himself would never influence his child, but he wished to warn him that someone was attacking him with every possible weapon. In particular, stories were being brought to Miss Ten Brinken's attention concerning Dr. Monin's very fast and loose living. The Privy Councillor told the captain the very same thing, except that instead of saying anything about business, he remarked that he would not be displeased to see his daughter marry into such a highly respected and ancient family as the Geraldingen. During the next few weeks, the two rivals avoided each other carefully, and at the same time redoubled their attentions towards Alraune. Especially Dr. Monin saw to it that her slightest wish was fulfilled. When he heard that she wanted a certain necklace with 7 rows of pearls, which she had seen in the shop of a jeweler in Cologne, he at once rode over there and purchased it. And when he noticed that for a second Miss Ten Brinken was really delighted with his gift, he felt certain that he had found the way to her heart and began to shower her with precious stones. It's true that for the purpose he had to do a little levying on the cash box of the Ten Brinken firm, but he was so sure of his affair that he did it with an easy conscience, and looked upon the little enforced borrowing as just an extension of credit to which he was almost entitled, and which he would return to the business just as soon as the millions of the dowry were his. His Excellency would only laugh over his little trick, of that he was sure. And His Excellency did laugh, but not in the way the good doctor had anticipated. On the very day that Alraune received the necklace, he rode into the city and discovered at once where the wooer had found the means of purchasing his gift, but he did not say a single word. Count Geraldingen could not afford to give away any pearls. In the first place, there were no accounts from which he could borrow, and there was not a right-minded jeweler anywhere who would have advanced him as much as a pennyworth on credit. But he did compose sonnets to Miss Ten Brinken, and they were rather good sonnets, too. He painted her portrait in her young lad's costume, and he fiddled for her, not indeed Beethoven, which was the music he loved, but Offenbach, because she would rather. Then came the Privy Councillor's birthday, and they were both invited to supper, and the collision took place. Privately, Alraune asked each one of them to escort her to the table, so that when the servant announced that dinner was served, they both hastened to her side. Each one felt the other's intrusion as unwarranted and tactless, and each one said a few words, mostly in an inaudible voice. Alraune signed to Wulf Gontram. "If the gentlemen can agree," she said laughingly, and took his arm. At table conversation lagged at first, and the Privy Councillor had to do most of the talking, but soon the two lovers grew warm with the many toasts that were drunk to the health of the councillor and his charming little daughter. Karl Monin was toastmaster, and Alraune threw him such glances that the captain felt his blood pound hotly in his temples. A little later, however, as they were at their dessert, she put her little hand on the count's arm, just for a second, but still long enough to make the doctor's round fish eyes almost pop out. When they arose, she permitted both of them to lead her, and danced around with each of them. During a waltz, she found opportunity to say to each one separately, "Oh, that was disgusting on the part of your friend. I'm sure you're not going to stand for it." The Count answered, "Of course not," and Dr. Monin drew himself up proudly and declared, "You can count on me." The next morning their little disagreement appeared no less childish to the doctor than to the hussar, but both of them had an uneasy feeling that they had given their promise to Miss Ten Brinken. "I'll challenge him to a pistol combat," said Dr. Monin, but he didn't really think it would reach that point. But the captain thought that in any case it would be well to send to Dr. Monin a couple of friends. Then he would see what decision the court of honor would reach. Dr. Monin talked with the seconds and explained that the Count was his very closest friend, and he certainly did not wish him any harm. If the Count would only apologize, then everything would be settled, and he wanted to say in all confidence that the very day after the wedding he was prepared to pay all of his friend's debts. The two officers, however, declared that this was indeed very nice of him, but did not concern them. The captain felt that he had been insulted and demanded satisfaction, and it was their duty to ask him if he were sufficiently chivalrous to accept the challenge. Triple exchange of shots at 15 paces. Dr. Monin started. "What? Triple exchange of shots?" he stuttered. Then the officer of the hussars laughed. "Calm yourself, my dear doctor. The court of honor will never sanction such a mad challenge for so slight an offense. This is just a question of the correct thing to do." Dr. Monin could see that, and so coming upon the healthy common sense of the members of the court of honor, he accepted the challenge. He went even further. He ran at once to his fraternity house, begged for armed protection, and in his turn sent two students to the captain to overwhelm his challenge. He demanded a quintuple exchange of shots at 10 pieces. That would get them, and then it would certainly make a great impression upon Miss Ten Brinken. The mixed court of honor was composed of both officers and student members of the fraternity, and they dealt rather reasonably. They decided upon a single exchange of shots at 20 paces. They couldn't do much damage that way, and honor would be amply satisfied. Hans Goldingen smiled when he heard the sentence and bowed in agreement, but Dr. Monin grew very pale. He had counted upon the court deciding that a duel was unnecessary and ordering them to ask each other for forgiveness. True, it was but a single bullet, but even that one might hit home. Very early on a gray morning, they all rode out to Cotton Forest, dressed in civilian clothes, but driving festively enough in 7 carriages, 3 officers of the hussars and the staff doctor, then Dr. Monin, and with him Wulf Gontram, followed by 2 fraternity brothers of Dr. Monin and one of another corps, who was to act as umpire, and another medical doctor, Dr. Pierenbaum, a former fraternity man. In addition, there came along 2 officers, orderlies, and 2 fraternity servants, and an assistant to the staff doctor. There was still another member, His Excellency Ten Brinken. There was still another member, His Excellency Ten Brinken. He had offered his office manager his medical assistance and had hunted out his old case and had it all polished up like new. For 2 hours they rode through the smiling dawn. Count Goldingen was in an excellent mood. On the previous night he had received a little missive from Lendennick. There was a 4-leaf clover inside, and on a slip of paper was the single word, Mascot. He had put the letter in his lower vest pocket, and the feel of it now and then made him laugh and think of all the good things of life. He chatted with his comrades and jested over the children's duel. He was the best pistol shot in town, and he was half of a mind to shoot a button off the doctor's sleeve. But one could never be sure, no matter how good a marksman one was, especially when one had a strange pistol in one's hand. So the best thing to do was to shoot in the air, for it would be a very mean and low trick even to scratch his good old friend, the doctor. Dr. Monin, however, who sat with the Privy Councillor and young Gontram in one carriage, said nothing at all. He too had received a little letter from Alraune, as he could recognize by her tall, oblique writing, and there was a dainty golden horseshoe inside. But he had scarcely looked at his mascot. He had mumbled something about childish superstition and thrown the letter on his desk. He was really frightened, thoroughly frightened, and his fear acted like dishwater on the fire of his love. He called himself a fool for getting up so early just in order to ride out to the field of honor. He had a burning desire to beg the captain's pardon and thus be rid of the whole business, and nothing but the feeling of shame which he would experience before the Privy Councillor, and still more before Wulf Gontram, to whom he had told so many brave tales of his deeds of heroism, prevented him. Now he sat in the carriage and pondered and tried to smoke his cigarette and assume a very calm expression, but he was pale as chalk when the carriages stopped and everyone stepped down to take the long, narrow path through the woods to the distant clearing. The doctor saw to their bandages. The umpire opened the pistol cases and loaded the deadly weapons. He weighed the powder very carefully so that both shots should be equally powerful. The pistols were an exceptionally fine set. The seconds, meanwhile, chose for their clients. The seconds, what's that mean? The seconds, meanwhile, chose for their clients. They drew matches, long wins, short loses. The captain of horse smiled as he saw all these slow and solemn preparations, which no one took any too seriously. But Dr. Monin turned away and stared at the ground. Then the umpire laid out the 20 paces. He made enormous leaps while the officers looked on a bit disapprovingly. It didn't seem altogether fitting that this gentleman should take it upon himself to turn the whole matter into a broad farce. After all, there was a certain decorum to be observed. This clearing will be too small, Major von der Osten called out sarcastically, but the tall Westphalian answered calmly as he paused for a breath. Then the gentlemen can shoot at each other from behind the trees. That will make it still safer. The seconds led the principals to their places, and the umpire once again urged them to settle their differences amicably. He did not even wait for an answer, however, but went right on. Since both sides declined to come to a peaceful reconciliation, I begged the gentlemen to watch for my command. A deep sigh escaped from Dr. Monin. He stood there with wobbling knees, the pistol drooping from his trembling hand. His drawn features were pale as a shroud. One moment, please, cried Dr. Pirenbaum, and hastened with long strides over to Karl Monin's side. The Privy Councillor, Wulf Gontram, and the two gentlemen from the fraternity followed. What is the matter? Asked Pirenbaum. Dr. Monin did not answer. He stared ahead, completely undone. Well, what seems to be the trouble, doctor? His second repeated, picked up the pistol and put it back into Karl's hand. But Dr. Monin was silent. He looked as though he were drunk. A smile broke out on the Privy Councillor's broad face. He approached one of the seconds and whispered into his ear. The second gave a short laugh. They all preserved the seriousness demanded by the occasion. Incontinentia alvi, Dr. Pirenbaum declared solemnly. He took a little phial out of his pocket, put a few drops of tincture of opium upon the lump of sugar. All right, we'll see if we can finish this without the ad popping up and chopping off my broadcast. The second gave a short laugh. They all preserved the seriousness demanded by the occasion. Incontinentia alvi, Dr. Peerenbaum declared solemnly. He took a little out of his pocket, put a few drops of tincture of opium upon a lump of sugar, and handed it to Dr. Monin. There you are, nibble at this, he said, and put it into Karl's mouth. Pull yourself together. Of course, such a duel is really a very terrible business. But the poor doctor heard nothing, saw nothing, did not even feel the bitter opium on his tongue. Vaguely, he was aware of figures receding. Then the voice of the umpire struck his ears. One, then after a pause, two, and along with the two he heard a shot. He closed his eyes, his teeth chattered. The landscape spun around like a whirling saucer. Three came from the edge of the wood. Then his own pistol went off. The loud report, so close to him, stunned him, so that his legs gave way. He did not fall. He sank into himself. He just settled down gradually on the dewy ground. He sat there for a minute or two, though it seemed hours to him. Then it occurred to him that the business was no doubt finished. It's all over, he murmured with a happy sigh. He felt himself everywhere. No, he had not been wounded at all. No one was bothering about him, so he rose unaided and felt with surprise how extremely rapidly his strength returned to him. With long, deep breaths, he drank in the morning air. Ah, but it was good to be alive. He became aware of a dense knot of people standing together on the other side of the clearing. He polished his spectacles and looked. All of them had their backs turned to him. He approached slowly, recognized first Wulf Gontram, who was standing far to the rear, then a few others who were kneeling, and finally saw someone lying down in their midst. Was that the captain? Was it possible that he had hit him? Why, he couldn't even recall having fired. He took a circuitous route around the high pine trees and came out on the other side, and now he saw plainly enough. He saw the Count's eye catch sight of him, and then he saw the Count beckon to him lightly with his hand. Everyone stepped aside. He entered the circle. Hans Geraldingen stretched his right hand out to him. He knelt down and took it in his. Forgive me, he mumbled. I really didn't want to. The captain smiled. I know it, old friend. It was a coincidence, a goddamned coincidence. Some sudden pain then seized him so that he groaned out loud. When his pain subsided, he spoke again in a low voice. I just wish to tell you, doctor, that I'm not angry at you. Dr. Monin did not answer. The corners of his mouth twitched. His eyes filled with big tears. The doctors drew him away and returned to their task at the wounded man's side. There's nothing to be done, the staff doctor whispered. We've got to try to get him to the clinic as fast as possible, said the privy councillor. It won't do any good, Dr. Peerenbaum replied. He'll die on our hands on the way. It would just be unnecessary torture for him. The bullet had penetrated the stomach, it had torn through his intestines, and then crashed into the backbone where it had stuck fast. But it seemed as though a secret power had drawn the bullet there with an irresistible attraction. It had gone straight through the lower vest pocket, through Alraune's little letter. It had torn through the four-leaf clover and cut through the word mascot. It was the diminutive lawyer Manasse who saved Dr. Monin. When King's Counsel Gontram showed him the letter which he had just received from Ledennik, then Manasse declared that the Privy Councillor was the most hard-hearted scoundrel he had ever come across, and he adjured his colleague not to communicate the charge to the district attorney's office until the doctor was in safety. It was not a question of the duel. Criminal proceedings had already been instituted on that account on the very day of the encounter, but of the embezzlement in His Excellency's office, and the lawyer himself ran to the delinquent's room and roused him out of bed. Up, he snapped. Get dressed. Pack your trunks. You've got to take the next train to Antwerp, and then get across the ocean as quick as possible. You're a jackass. You're a camel. How in hell could you do such a stupid thing? Dr. Monin rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. I don't know what this ad is, but it better stop. Dr. Monin rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. He shook his head. He couldn't see what the trouble was. The privy councillor was all for him. Why, he had said, but Manas would not let him go on. All for you, he barked. Yes, all for you. Why, you damn fool, it's His Excellency himself who gave the King's Council the order to lay charges against you before the district attorney's office because you filched from his cash box. Then Karl Monin decided to creep out of bed. His old friend Stanislaus Shocked helped him to get away. It was he who studied the timetables, furnished the necessary money, and procured the automobile that was to take him to Cologne. It was a sad parting. For 30 years, Karl Monin had lived in this city, whose every building, almost every stone, held memories for him. Here he had his roots, here his life had a foundation, and now he was suddenly thrown out into a cold and unknown world. Head over heels. You'll write to me, said the heavy Shocked. What do you propose to do anyhow? Karl Monin hesitated. His whole life was broken up, blasted, destroyed. Its pieces lay in a heap of dust before him. He shrugged his shoulders. His good-natured eyes gazed out sadly. I don't know, he mumbled, but the habit of years came out upon his lips. He smiled amid his tears. I'll make a fine match, he said. There are many rich girls over there in America. And that is the end of chapter 9. And we are getting closer to the end of the book. As you can see, we're probably, not 2/3 of the way, but what is it? Probably 3/5 of the way. All right, Bob, that's all. Goodbye.